Thanks for joining me today on The Rocks. For this episode, our special guest is my longtime friend, Jarrett, aka Fish Heavenston, the CEO of Stump Technologies. Fish is a retired 25-year Army and Air Force veteran and entrepreneur. Prior to founding Stump, Fish served in the Army for 10 years, including with the 2nd Ranger Battalion as a jungle warfare instructor and with the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. In 2001, Fish joined the Air Force and became a combat controller, and from there he deployed 12 times to Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Africa, developing air infrastructure and controlling close air support for Special Operations Forces. He retired in 2016 and founded Stump with 2 former teammates. Today, Stump provides aerial mapping, communication support, unmanned systems training, and software development to government, defense, and enterprise clients, including exploration mining companies all across the globe. Thanks again for joining. Pour a glass of good whiskey, or bad if that's your preference, and let's go on the rocks. Well, Fish, thanks so much for joining me here on the rocks. I'm excited to have a drink with you and talk about what you've been working on lately. First, what are you drinking tonight? What have you got?
This evening, I have Big Horn Bourbon whiskey all the way from Willie's Distillery in Ennis, Montana.
Nice.
Yeah.
And how is it?
It's delicious. We've had our tech rodeo out there in Ennis, Montana for the last 2 years. And we happened upon Willie's Distillery. He was good friends and grew up in the Ranger Regiment with one of our guys at Stump. And every time we go out there now, we bring a bunch of bottles back. So, Willie's Distillery, Ennis, Montana, Big Horn Bourbon.
Giving him a shout out. Love it. I'll have to try it. Well, tonight I picked up, and it is night. We are actually drinking after 5 o'clock, which, believe it or not, for our listeners is a rarity. Usually I get to do a little day drinking when we're doing the podcast. But I'm drinking IW Harper's 15-year. Have you heard of them?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So I had not. And I saw their label on the shelf and their motto, anywhere, anytime, it's always a pleasure. And that's why I picked it. And I got great reviews. But I thought, that's such a cool, for an aviation and mapping guy like yourself. I thought that was a motto to go with. And also the story behind their founder of, a German immigrant with $4 in his pocket coming and setting up, I think back in like 1870. They've been around for a long time. And then moved overseas to Asia, basically, for a while, only sold over in Japan or based out of there. And then they just came back from overseas in 2015 and launched 2 lines here. But it's a great tasting bourbon. It's really good. And just a really unique story, an entrepreneur, much like both of us, kind of a unique story. So, and it's good to drink.
Yes.
Halfway through mine.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And in that line, so tell me, we've been catching up a little bit offline, but tell our listeners what you're up to, and in particular, your lava beds initiative or project.
Yeah, this is the first time I can actually say I'm making a movie, or working on making a movie, and not have it be a joke. So last summer, my son and we took a road trip. And one of the areas that we stopped at was the Lava Beds National Monument in Modoc County, which is where I grew up. And even though I had spent almost all of my life less than 100 miles from the lava beds, I had never actually been there. Mm-hmm. And so when I took my son there, I was just amazed. I mean, it was so beautiful. The rugged landscape, the caves. And one of the features at Lava Beds National Monument is a battleground. It's a monument to the Modoc Indian War of 1872 and 1873. And there you'll find a natural fortress called Captain Jack's Stronghold. Captain Jack was the Modoc Indian chief who led a small group of Modoc Indians in their fight to save their homeland from westward expansion in the U.S. Army. And when I went to Captain Jack's Stronghold, it was absolutely inspiring to me as far as the terrain goes, that I was like, man, I want to map this, because as you know, Emily, part of Stump's core business is aerial mapping with UAVs. And I thought to myself, just for posterity, I would like to map this. And I took about 3 or 4 more steps and I said, no way, I'm going to make a movie. I want to make a movie about it. So as soon as I got done, as soon as my son and I had toured the Stronghold, I called my close friend, Stacy Grant, who is an entrepreneur herself. She is the CEO of a film company up in Philadelphia called Koi Fly Creative. And she's done a lot of our marketing videos for us in the past. And I said, hey, Stacy, you want to make a movie? And so fast forward a year, we went out there this past June and we filmed I always feel funny saying this, a sizzle reel.
Yeah.
In an attempt to use that as a vehicle to raise funds and interest in sponsors and donors for us to create a documentary, not necessarily about the Modoc Indian War, but about the terrain itself. And what we're going to, the theme really for the documentary is OCOKA. And OCOKA is the acronym that the military uses for terrain analysis. It stands for observation, cover and concealment, obstacles, key terrain, and avenues of approach. And so what we want to do is not only go out there and film the Stronghold, but map it with UAVs, map it with LiDAR, and then have some of our subject matter experts from the soft community, from the infantry community that can go out there and speak to each one of those letters in the acronym, let's say obstacles, for example, and highlight a few pieces of terrain out there and how they were an obstacle, maybe obviously for the U.S. Army, but also it may have been an impediment for the Native Americans as well, because, terrain doesn't necessarily pick a side.
Right.
It's just there. And so we want to use it as a professional development tool for perhaps the military applications, something for natural history buffs and military history buffs. I think that it can be a production that can appeal to a lot of folks. So we have the final cut or close to the final cut right now. Hopefully by the time this podcast hits the air, we'll have a target of what we need to do for fundraising in order to execute this. But it's a fun project, and I'm happy that you have chosen to be involved with it. I think that having you as a subject matter expert on the geological component about how the lava beds got formed will be a fascinating way to present how did all of this get.
Why is it there? Yeah.
Why is it there? Yeah.
I think what's so cool to me about telling this story is how terrain is clearly shaped by geology, right? Which is a true statement that seems pretty basic, but I think people forget about, and that we as humans interact with terrain every day, right? And it's kind of like the geology that's just sitting there that actually impacts your day-to-day life. And in the same way where we at Prospector try to talk about how mining is so important, and mining comes from geology. And mining
Right.
is a key part of what we all do every day, even when people don't think about it. And what really stood out to me when I saw your post about this movie and the story is that, terrain dramatically has impacted military battles in the past, and I would imagine still does, right? And that's part of why you're trying to use this as a learning example.
It's a lot like my second assignment when I was in the Army was as a jungle warfare instructor. And, you can't beat the jungle. That we would have units that would come down to Panama all the time. You've got guys that have got thick leather gloves on and their sleeves are all rolled down and everything's buttoned up, and they're just going to become a heat casualty. You almost have to learn how to assimilate with your environment. And that's the Modocs are a good representation of that. It was their homeland. They knew what the environment was like and how to exist in it. And you just can't imagine what it must have been like for these people who, yes, they took shelter in these collapsed lava tubes, but it's the winter time, it's December and January, and it's below freezing, it's snow, and there's no vegetation around, very little fuel for fire. And the Modocs soundly defeated the U.S. Army in 2 defensive battles where they were outnumbered. And the first battle, they were outnumbered 3 to 5 to 1. And the second battle, they were outnumbered over 10 to 1. But they had that advantage of the terrain. They knew how to use it and exploit it. And they worked with it instead of against it. And it really bloodied the U.S. Army. I find it a very fascinating story. It's a sad story in our history for sure, but from a military mindset, there's a lot to be learned there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think from a geologic perspective, it's a unique place. It's an alien looking landscape in many ways, right? I mean, it's really unique because of it being a shield volcano. It's not what people think of when they think of a volcano setting, right? You kind of think of a really steep-sided Mount St. Helens type eruption, and that's not what this was. These were kind of slow liquid flows that created these almost river-like features and chimneys. So it's amazing for me to think about, just so many connections historically, like what people thought happened there, right? Before people understood geology or came up with geologic theory in terms of how this stuff became present and how they interacted with it. So I'm really excited to see how the video progresses and follow the project's progress. And I think it's also such a unique example of how far mapping technology has come, right? And lots of crossover with mining and archaeology and all the different industries that you all work in with military and industry. But I mean, like, this is detail that you really couldn't capture with mapping technology until recently, right? I mean, it's come so far.
For me personally, I've always been fascinated about maps. Every time I see one hanging on a wall or a globe, or I just always stop and pause and I look. I'm checking it out. I'm looking at the relationship between locations and trying to find any known landmarks there that I might recognize. I've read several books about the lava beds in the past year, and you look at the first maps that they had of it, and it's just there's no cartographer there. It's somebody's impression of the terrain that they're observing from 3 to 5 kilometers away. No soldier had actually walked that terrain and done a proper map on it. So to see that map that was created over 150 years ago now and compare it to what we can create today, in less than an hour, that's one of the illustrative things that I would like to bring out in the video, is how much better we are now, how much more capable we are of understanding our environment, using technology to enable us to make better decisions because we have more information available to us in the detail that we can get in now when we map. We can measure, even though that our aircraft are flying at 400 feet, we can create a digital surface model that has terrain elevations accurate down to a centimeter or two.
That's crazy. And engineering quality, right? I mean, these are, I mean, this is stuff that you can build.
Absolutely. Plans. With a proper surveyor there, we can, instead of using a standard GPS on the aircraft, we use real-time kinematic GPS, which is survey grade. We can get absolute accuracies down to an inch or less when we're flying. So absolutely, I think that for most of the stuff that folks are doing, as far as design goes, we can get really, really close. And for the mining industry, when you're talking about, you're measuring stockpiles or tailings or how much material was removed from a mine or the open pits, we can do it very, very accurately.
Well, and with I also, as I understand it, the change detection capabilities, you can also monitor like slope stability and stuff like that from a safety perspective can be really important also, right? I mean, those small shifts in certain mine structures can be really things you want to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Interesting thing too about safety is that using these remote sensing, you don't have to have a surveyor that's down there, with a prism pole walking around a busy mining operation. So we reduce the chance for injury. We do not need to shut down operations in order to collect data. I find it absolutely fascinating. what UAV technology, and I'll just say unmanned systems as well, because we're getting at Tough Stump, we're starting to get into some of the UGVs as well. So we've got the unmanned aerial vehicles, and now we're getting into the unmanned ground vehicles as well. Just the amount of data they can go in the places that they can go where we don't have to send people.
And maybe for folks who aren't familiar with UAVs, I mean, drones, right, is what most people kind of call them. But do you want to kind of give some UAV or drone basics, maybe debunk any misconceptions about them and what the typical questions you get about them? I'm guessing you don't just go pick them up at Walmart like the DJIs and throw them up in the air and do your work.
Yeah, we use primarily we use drones from a manufacturer called SenseFly. They're the global leader in fixed wing mapping drones. Fixed wing drones mean that they fly just like an airplane. In our case, our drone has a pusher prop, which means the propeller is located behind the airplane. That increases the safety of the overall plane itself. So if there's because the airplane's flying forward, if it hits anything, by the way, the drone's made of foam, so it's very, very light.
Not very big,
low
too. When we say plane, it's like, few feet.
Yeah, it's about 3.5, 4 feet, 4 foot wide wingspan, let's say. So we tend to use a lot of fixed wing drones, but the UAV industry is certainly dominated by the multicopters. So they could be quadcopters, which means they have 4 propellers, hexacopters, which is 6, octocopters, which is 8. And once you get in the octocopter range, you're talking about a pretty big machine where it might have 6 or more feet from tip to tip. And we've used some of those in the past. The good thing about the multicopters or the multirotors is that they can generally carry a heavier payload, but they're not as efficient in flight. Whereas the fixed wings, they're not going to carry, depending upon size, they don't necessarily carry as heavy of a payload, but they can operate a lot longer. So we can generally get about an hour and a half of flight time out of our EV drones, where most drones are at about the 45-minute range. So most multicopters, 45 minutes to an hour. But I think that a lot of folks who watch the news, think that drones means, that they're sentient, that they're up there making decisions all by themselves, that at some point there's going to be a big flash and, they're all going to come hunting for the people. And really, that's not the case. Just about all these autonomous aircraft are either directly controlled by a human or they have a pre-programmed flight path that they're following. There's a lot of safety mechanisms installed in them in the software that if there's any deviations, most of the time they're designed to come right back home. Or if there's a problem, they're going to land right away. So I've been involved in the drone industry now for about a decade. I started when I was nearing the end of my time in the Air Force. And the growth is all in very positive directions. And it's a very exciting industry to be a part of because there are seismic advances in technology just about every year.
Yeah.
And it's fun to stay abreast of. And I really think that there's more so than the mapping side when it comes to mining, there's some other exciting advances that are going to be coming out that are going to enable operations.
Oh, okay. What would those look like? What do you think is coming down the pipeline?
To me, I think that it's going to be delivery. And I think that you would be a good sounding board here, because for a lot of these energy exploration companies and mining companies and oil, I have heard that when something breaks, right, when a truck breaks or a conveyor belt breaks, oftentimes it's not a colossal part, right? It may just be a bushing or a bearing or, a small electronic widget. Now, in the United States, we have the infrastructure to replace those fairly quickly. Yeah. But if you're in Africa or South America, where some of these mine sites are very remote, it may only be 15 miles away, but it takes you 2 days to get there.
As
right?
we say in Maine,
so
get there from here. Yeah.
Yeah, you just can't get there from here. So we've seen a lot of it over the past 3 years, 4 years. There's a company that's called Zipline that's been doing a lot of great medical work in Africa by sending blood and medicine to villages. And I think that the same thing's going to happen with mining operations and energy operations, where you'll be able to say, our dump truck is broken. Well, what do we need? We need a new bearing. Well, the parts that you need may only be 5 pounds, but you need them right now. And otherwise you have to idle the whole operation, which could cost $1 million or more a day. And so the delivery drones could really give you an opportunity to say, you call back to that supply station on the coast and say, hey, we need a new Fitzer valve.
Yeah.
And, they package one up and it's there in a matter of hours instead of days.
Well, I know this is a mining podcast, but I have another industry to suggest for you for that, which would be the boating and yachting industry. Because down here in Florida, and we go across to the Bahamas all the time on our boat. And it's amazing how much money people have to pay if their boat breaks down because of a this or a that while it's stuck over in the Bahamas and the Caribbean. It's like, man, you shoot a drone over there with all those things that my husband understands that I don't, that break all the time on people's boats. People would pay a premium. So don't neglect the mining industry, but you may want to add that one to your list. Yeah. No,
Well, we're working on, to complement the drones, we're working on some automated logistics software to, in the military, we talk about machine-to-machine handoffs because we're working a lot with different types of data links and things like that. So we're working on some kind of machine-to-machine logistics ordering and fulfillment that would complement these delivery drones. One of the things that we've seen is that a lot of these companies, they have a very mature idea on how their drone is going to fly and deliver equipment, but that whole circle about how an order is placed and where it's coming from and how it's going to be fulfilled, and then advising the requester on providing the updates on his equipment or on his order, how and when it's going to be fulfilled. That's not quite there yet. So we think that over the past year, we've been working on some solutions that I think will be very complementary, I guess, to the whole delivery drone piece.
No, oh, that's really cool. I think that's one of the neat things about working in innovative technology also, I think, because you're right there at the forefront where you start to see where the gaps are, right? I mean, you start to see where you can kind of optimize and all those other cheesy like strategize or whatever the latest lingo is. But I think what's so neat about that also is you start to see the crossovers from other industries. Because maybe one industry, in this case, maybe it was the military that's a little bit farther ahead, in fact, than industry and how those systems work and talk to each other and how can it be applied to commercial industries. Other times it's the other way around, right? And it's commercial tech that leads the way. And how can something that works well in mining cross over into yachting and boating, right? And I think that's where working with the cool new stuff that comes out, it's unique in that way. That's what makes it fun for me, at least, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Is there anything else other than the delivery stuff that's new and coming out that you see going on in the space?
Well, I mentioned the unmanned ground vehicles. We've recently become a reseller for a company called Ghost Robotics, and they're one of the 4 companies in the world that really make a quadruped robot, the dog.
The dogs,
yeah, that can actually do work. And when I say do work, I mean, there's a couple of companies that make a little dog that'll run around next to you and stuff like that, but it's not a tool. You can't put a sensor platform on it. And so I really think that the mining industry is a great place to use these dogs because they do have a degree of autonomy where they can be programmed to follow a path and do the same thing every day. So whether it's performing LiDAR scans underground, whether it is monitoring some of these underground mines for unsafe conditions with different types of sensors that they have on board, and then transmitting that information in real time back to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
This is an area where I am kind of ignorant on all the types of use cases, but I understand that, wow, here's an amazing tool that's ruggedized. These Ghost Robotics dogs they're dang near bulletproof.
Yeah.
And they can be submerged, and they can properly outfitted. They can even swim across a pond or something like that. And the open source platform that they are allows users to optimize them with whatever type of sensor equipment that they need. I think that's, for me, that's going to be the next big push for Tough Stump.
You mentioned like the data side, and I know back when I did some work with drone surveys or UAV surveys, one of the challenges in the exploration space, right, not necessarily in an operating mine, but when you're out doing early stage exploration, was the areas were so large, and the UAVs did a great job of capturing super high quality imagery, but then like it literally would almost break the computer trying to process it. Or there would be a few days of processing time because the data set was so large. Has that kind of come forward at all, like the processing ability, and therefore like?
So I'll tackle that on.
Yeah.
I'll tackle that on two sides. So let's talk about the UAV space first. The limiting factor has really always been the hardware, right? The UAVs, they go out there, they collect their data. And in this case, for your listeners, we're talking about photogrammetry. Mm-hmm. So when we set up a UAV, it's taking hundreds, if not thousands, of individual still pictures that are then brought back to a computer, and we run those photos through what's called photogrammetry software that allows us to create a two-dimensional overhead image, but also three-dimensional surface model of the terrain, and also a point cloud and a three-dimensional textured mesh, which means that we have a kind of a cartoon-like representation of the terrain below. We've begun providing our customers with more powerful 3D workstations that really have cut the time that it takes to process this data from days down to hours. Typically, if we have about 1,000 photographs, which would be about 2 kilometers or so worth of data, we can process that in about 2 to 3 hours. Now, with the LiDAR data that we would probably want to collect from using a UGV, so something, a ground robot, we've recently began working with a company called Mach 9 Robotics, and they have some amazing software applications that allow the real-time streaming of this LiDAR data. And from what we've been able to ascertain, there's really no post-processing involved. And something that we're going to begin working a lot more with this company, the understanding where the left and right limits are, because for us working a lot with government and DoD applications, the speed at which we would need to get this LiDAR data back to a decision maker is critical.
Yeah.
But it may also be quite valuable in the mining industry because of simplicity. There's not a whole lot of extraneous software that goes into producing a model. Now, we still have to do our due diligence, but I think that we've got that Mach 9 is definitely onto something, and they're one to watch.
Very cool. I think that's where, to me, the huge benefit of any kind of data is helping you get to the right decision faster, right? And that's where I think the speed, it's not that it has to be faster for more applications to fit in the mining industry. Maybe it might just be that it's more of what are the decisions where a drone or a UAV is most helpful in speeding that up, right? And I think that's where you kind of match up the decision timeline with the capture and the processing timeline to make it really effective and use the right tool for the right question, right? Yeah.
One of the things that Tough Stump wants to bring to our customers, especially our enterprise customers, is the ability to interpret and visualize geospatial data without having to be a geospatial expert.
Right.
There's a lot of geospatial programs which are absolutely fantastic for exploitation and analysis of three-dimensional point clouds and digital surface models and geotiffs and all this stuff. But what if somebody is in the boardroom, right? And you've got your investors, and you've got your principals, and these guys want to hold the chalk, right? They want to be the one that's actually driving the map and querying the data. So we work really hard to not necessarily create data that is only digestible by, let's say, ArcGIS, for example, or Esri. These are programs that people know very well. But how can we dumb it down just a little bit, so that, folks that, we're making this information more accessible and more user-friendly for people to use in, a briefing and perhaps a meeting where we're going to dive down into this site here, and then we're going to, move real quickly across the map to another site, and be able to control all that in the boardroom with a limited amount of geospatial engineering expertise.
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge opportunity in the mining space too. And we've seen a few essentially marketing companies helping mining or exploration companies to do that, start to tell the story visually. But I think you're spot on. Like, if you can get it to the level where a decision maker can interact with the data and really interact with it, right? Be able to kind of move around and see things in 3 dimensions, be there. I think it's also where virtual reality tools that some of the bigger mining companies use for internal collaboration has a real investor relation and marketing component that could be used, right? Put your investors inside, not just the mine, but the deposit. Let them see why you are moving over into this area, or what the rocks look like over there. Let them see what the equipment looks like in the tunnel. I mean, it's amazing, right? There's nobody out there who wouldn't have a really cool, amazing time doing a mine tour. And I know folks on some of the folks on my team, like Jeff Scanlon, would agree with that. It's the same thing. Like, you have all this data that can tell an amazing story, and decision makers are impacted by stories. That's what helps people make decisions, right? Whether it's a military component or a business decision. It helps in people remember stories. They remember what they look like and feel like when they're in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. For a long time, even when I was in the Air Force, we had, when we looked at drop zone and landing zone surveys, everything is organized in a folder, and it's, I want to be able to see it on a map, right? How do I open up the Google Earth, for example, and I can just, go to any area on the globe and say, okay, let me see all of my C-130 drop zones, right? Mm-hmm. Or all of my C-130 landing zones, where in your case, I could, go and say, all right, where are all my, my mature gold mines? Where are my, all of my
prospectorportal.com.
Yeah, there we go.
So that's how we built it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but absolutely. So yeah. If there's anybody who loves the map more than a military person, it's a geologist, right? So I hear you on that. Maps make sense and they tell stories, right?
They do. They absolutely do.
Yeah. Well, with that, normally I would ask mining industry folks who come on this podcast, I ask them if they could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the industry, what would they change? Now, since you're not kind of our typical guest, instead, I'm going to ask you, what do you think the mining industry could do differently for people to be more interested or pay more attention to it?
Wow. What do I think the mining industry could do different to raise awareness?
Yeah, because that's the number one thing we hear from folks in the industry is we're doing all this cool stuff. We're trying to make all these positive changes, and yet nobody kind of hears our story or thinks our industry is important. So for someone who's sort of on the outside, do you have any thoughts?
That's really deep.
That's why we give you a drink at the beginning.
Yeah. Boy. Well, mining's kind of like that unsung energy, or, that unsung natural resource industry, right? I mean, every day you hear about oil and gas and stuff like that, but you really don't hear about all the things that mining does that power our cell phones, that power our computers, that power the Teslas and all of these things that people are beginning to demand more and more, right? You know, they say, well, we want to, you know, we got to get away from fossil fuels and da, da, da. Oh, okay. Well, mining, you know, what's your answer, right? How many times do we hear about electric vehicles and the need to push away from fossil fuels, but we don't hear about the importance of investing in domestic lithium production?
Right. Yeah. Certainly not from people who aren't in the industry. I mean, in the industry, people feel, you know, they're like we're all yelling at each other about how important it is. But outside, you don't hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it might be perhaps the mining industry needs to embark on a bit of a PR campaign that says, hey, do you like your Tesla?
Right.
Well, do you realize that we get all, 90%, I'm making up some numbers here, 85% of those batteries came from other places other than the United States.
Yeah.
And do we realize how important it is for us to be able to secure our own lithium or, pick another rare earth metal?
Yeah.
I don't know how well those resonate in television commercials, but the more and more that I spent my time in Africa in the military, I began to realize, it's not just gold and silver that are mined, but some of the components that we rely on for as a small business owner, I don't know how anybody had a small business before a smartphone.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right? Or laptops and absolutely.
Yeah. And so what would be the impact to our day-to-day life if we no longer had some of these rare earth metals that are coming from these very far-flung reaches of the globe, and how important that they are to our day-to-day life, and why we should pay attention to instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah, how interconnected we all are.
Here is why you should care about the government of Peru and whether or not they're friendly to the United States.
Right.
Those are probably some important issues.
And I think the industry could start by making more movies, including this is not a joke. It's part of what I thought was so cool about what you're doing with the lava bed story, right? And the Modoc Indian story. It's tell the story of geology, and from geology, the story of mining. You got to get it into popular culture. You got to get that narrative out. So that's my due out to the listeners. If Fish shares with us a way to support the making of this documentary, that's one small step, to show how geology and therefore terrain at a larger scale, mining and the industry, are all connected, right? And tell that story out to people that wouldn't normally think about it or hear it, right?
Yeah.
So make more.
That was a good question. You really had me thinking there, Emily.
That's the goal. That's the goal. Yeah. I can't just drink a cocktail and chit chat. But on that note,
perfect.
Thanks so much for coming on, and I hope I know our listeners will really enjoy hearing a little bit of a different episode this time, and teaching us a little bit about UAVs and drone technology and how they're worked in our industry, but also others, and kind of where it's going. So, cheers. Now you got to finish the drink.
Cheers, Emily. I'm on my second one. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I really love everything that you've done, not just for the mining industry, but for the indigenous people, in countries all over the world, and helping them gain wealth from their natural resources. I think that's one of the things that I've always admired about you, is that you are truly helping other people who are extremely disadvantaged, try and enabling them to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. So cheers to you.
Thank you. Cheers.